Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today's Application Packaging Experts Roundtable. Before we get started, wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A area of the webcast. Even if you don't have a specific question, but a suggestion for a topic we should cover, enter it there and our panel will address it. We do have some topics that we can speak to, but we're counting on you to drive the conversation. We can go up to an hour today and then join us next week for a continued discussion. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Mike O'Connor, our Senior Solution Engineer. James Baker, our Director of Sales, is not able to join this week. However, he's been on the panel in previous discussions, and he'll be on the meeting next week. And Spencer Anderson, our Major Account Manager. So with that, I'll hand it over to the panel to start addressing your questions.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate that. We definitely appreciate your questions coming in. If you've been with us the last couple of weeks, we haven't always gotten to them all, but we are collecting them all. So anything we don't answer, we will get to either today or in future weeks or ultimately in a blog post. But we really do intend to answer every question we get. So keep them coming. We try to kick things off with a couple of topics that are applicable to this packaging subject. And this week, we're looking at wrapping versus repackaging and some best practices around repackaging and customization and so forth. And it just so happens, I don't know if we can call it a coincidence, but Karen published a really good article just about a week ago on repackaging versus wrapping. So why don't you get us going on this, Karen?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bob. I really like this topic. I think this is very important, and I think this is one of those questions which comes into our IT pro mind very, very often. They run into this question very often. We understand that one of their daily jobs is to prepare softwares for deployments, and the big challenge is reliable deployments. You don't want the application fails to get installed on the endpoint. So this is quite a challenge, and when they are in the process of preparing a package for deployment, I think they very, very frequently run into this question of, hey, should I repackage or should I wrap this application, right, or this package? So I would like to get started with how are these two different, first of all, and then we'll try to see, some of the points that you would want to consider, some of the factors that you would want to consider to see which one fits you in that particular scenario. Because I would say it's not a
right, Karen. Definitions really count. Whenever I'm talking about packaging, I mean both, right? So when I say packaging, some people hear scripting, some people hear repackaging. The packaging is just the idea of getting an application, bundling it up however you are, and getting it automatically deployed. And you can take either approach.
Right.
It's a loaded word. Yeah.
You could take either approach. But I would not say that we always have a one blanket answer. Hey, you know what? You should always repackage or we should always wrap. No, I don't think so. That's right. Because I think it depends. It depends on the type of package that's on your hand now, the pack or the application that you're trying to prepare for deployment, or it also depends on the environment which you're dealing with, right? So before we get into those, so let's try to understand what is repackaging. Repackaging has been there since really, really long time, and Admin Studio has been a leading tool in repackaging. So I'm pretty sure most of the people here on the call, the audience, they know already, but just for the sake of it, right? So repackaging is a process or a method where you take one setup format and then you generally convert it to a different setup format. That's a very high level, but when you get into details, it's about you generally look for a legacy setup exe, exe format type, and you convert that or you repackage that to a different format, which is of a flexible format or open format. We all understand it's very difficult to know what exe has inside. It's a black box. You don't know what it does on your system. So MSI is relatively an open format. You could actually open MSI, see what all it has, what are all the files, what are the settings, and all of that. So repackaging you do to take a exe format and then convert it to an open format, something like MSI, or if you're into virtual environment, you'll convert it to AppV or the new one that is the MSIX format. That is one. And the second one is wrapping. So in wrapping, what you do is you generally write a script. It could be a VB script. It could be the old batch script or the new PowerShell script. And what you do is you'd write a script, and inside the script is where you'll leverage your actual setup, which is supplied by the vendor, along with its silent command line. And then you could also add, if you have any pre-install, post-install configurations, all of those together into one single script. Now, what it means is you've took your legacy exe and you have wrapped it inside of the script file. And when you deploy this, what you actually deploy is this wrapper, so the installation happens. So that's the basic difference. Now, if you have to...
Way long time ago, I was doing wrapper scripts before it really did anything else. Because I wanted to provide a consistent thing for the deployment team to always have. And so I had a install.bat, just a simple batch file, and then it was usually just the command line to install the package. And so that would be the most simple wrapper. But now, a lot of organizations want to leave a footprint for inventory purposes, or they want to clean up shortcuts or do different things. And I think PowerShell App Deploy Toolkit took it to the next level with some really good user interaction, right? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I think what they did was really cool, because we understand that writing script may not be as easy as it looks like. It might get quite complicated. Unlike you have something like YScript, which is like point and click and the script gets generated. But in case of PowerShell, you have to actually sit and write a script for you, right? So you want to write all the script for cleanup or the actual installation of the setup file with the silent command line. That might get a little complicated. And I think that is where the PowerShell App Deployment Toolkit comes really, really handy. And the best thing is we have integrated that toolkit in Admin Studio. And what we also do is we give you a sample template where the script is all ready. It is like a template, and all you have to do is, take a package inside the catalog and say, I want to wrap it using PowerShell, and Admin Studio will take care of filling up that template for you. So at the end of wrapping, you have a PowerShell script which is perfectly ready for deployment with all your silent command lines, with the setup and all of that. So that would make it a lot easier.
The beauty of the template is you can customize that one thing. And so if there's something standard that you always want to do, like I know a lot of people will customize the PowerShell App Deploy Toolkit to match their own color scheme or branding, put their own company logo on it, kind of make it their own, because it lends itself to do that. But if there's other things that you always do in a deployment, you just put them in that template, and then that one-click wrap operation is going to get you all those things. Now, you're probably going to want to tweak it some, though, right? Because for every application, now this shortcut is ending up in a place I don't want it. I want to delete or move it. That would be a separate, unique thing that you added for that one application. But the things that are consistent across the board, you just put them in that template, and you've got your consistency.
Hey, Bob and Kieran, I have a question around that. What happens if a new version comes out and update, right? Like, what do I do if I have a new version or update for that application to make changes to the app?
Just wrap the new version and push that one out. It really is that simple. And probably you'd be able to use the exact same wrapper. So if there were customizations that were unique to that application, they'd probably be applicable here. The difference being that, there's always that first time deployment is one that needs the extra attention around customization. Whereas if you are installing it over itself, you probably don't have to worry about, changing default settings and things, because they won't be overwritten by an update. So it depends, and then sometimes people will choose to remove the old one, install the new one, just as a matter of process, because they want to make sure it's gone. They had a problem one time. So you can cause yourself some trouble, I think, by overthinking it. In most cases, in pretty much every case, installing a new version of an application over the old one is something that the vendor has, tested and made sure works as it should.
The nice thing I was going to say with the PowerShell templates that we include from the PowerShell App Deploy Toolkit is everything's commented. Has nice sections. There's pre-installation, installation, post-installation, pre-uninstall, uninstall, post-uninstall. So that way you can you see exactly what you want to include. And to your point, Bob, you spend some extra time doing the first initial one, and you might have to do some tweaks and change. We're keeping the script. We're keeping it around in Admin Studio in the catalog. So when version 2 comes out next year, next month, whatever it is, you can go back to that script and see how you did it and say, oh, I had to add these extra things for this particular package. Likely you're going to have to do the same thing. And so it's just a copy and paste at that point.
Yeah. But it also takes us back to one of the reasons that repackaging is pretty popular is everybody isn't a PowerShell expert, right? So, and not only do you need to know how to script to make a good customized deployment with a wrapper, but you also need to really understand the application. If your intent is to have these certain settings be part of your deployment, then you have to understand how the application stores those settings. And if it's in the registry or an XML file or whatever, your script has to manipulate those things. So you have to first understand exactly what it is that you need to do, and then write that script code to actually make it happen. Whereas if you don't want to take that time, or you don't have that level of expertise, wrapping is the easy shortcut if it works, right? Because you do your initial snapshot, you install the application, customize it the way you want it, and then do your second snapshot, and that can, in a broad range of cases, get you that customized deployment you want without having to really understand the details of how the application works and how to script and automate it outside. But you had some reasons in your article, Kieran, that people tend to try to avoid repackaging.
Yeah, maybe I was thinking we'll see what should be the reason that you want to go for repackaging, and then we'll also try to understand what should be the reason you want to avoid repackaging and then go to wrapping. Okay. I think one simple, straightforward reason, I think, which is pretty simple to understand, is let's say your vendor doesn't have any silent command lines. Let's say the setup that was supplied by your vendor doesn't support any silent command lines, and you know that you want to install this silently. So you have no option other than repackaging it to MSI. Now, after you convert it to MSI, you have a bunch of standard command lines available for yourself, which are the MSI standards, for silent installation, not just for silent installation, for also customizations. You know the properties of MSI, you know what properties you could set and what are the values. So I think that is what I think is one of the primary reasons why somebody uses repackaging. That, hey, you know what, my vendor doesn't give me this the silent command line, so therefore I repackage. Along with that, there could be many other reasons. One reason that I see is repackaging is good if the type of systems or the operating system or the version in your entire organization are of same configuration, right? Like a gold image, the machines are almost the same. So when you repackage your application on such an image, it is guaranteed that it will always work when you deploy. But in case you have a hybrid set of machines, a mix of maybe Win 8 to Win 10 with different configurations and all of that, then maybe you don't want to do repackaging. You might want to maybe rather move to wrapping, right?
It goes back to understanding the application, right? So some installs are simply putting files down and a shortcut down, and that's the end of it. And if that's all that's happening, then you can repackage that quite easily. But if there's installation logic, if there's installation logic that's saying, okay, well, if you have this browser installed, I'm going to do this differently. If the version of Windows is different, or if security is different, or if it's any number of if this then that type things is where you get into trouble with certain applications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right. That sometimes it's. Go ahead, Mike.
I was just say, here's a good question, and I know we're going into some of the stuff here shortly. We were discussing this before we jumped on here, but how forthcoming are vendors to support their applications if they've been repackaged?
Yeah, we were just talking about that before we started.
Hey, Mike, you want to take that question? You're just talking about that.
Yeah, it's a common one I've gotten a lot asked over the years is, well, if I repackage it, then I won't get support from the vendor. And I think evidence bears that's not really the case. Probably the one exception to that would be healthcare, right? Because applications that are, that work with, devices in hospitals and things, and they're FDA certified or whatever the equivalent in your country is, those might need to go exactly how the vendor. But for the most part, I'd say most vendors, it's all about how the application itself, right? If it installs correctly with their installer, and when you repackage it, you're installing the same bits, right? It's now the logic is different, but in many cases, a lot of people like to repackage in the early days because there were so many different ways you could configure that application. And for me, as an IT pro in my organization, I really only want it configured one way anyway. I don't need all these extra options. So it simplifies the installer a bit. But I haven't really ever come across a vendor not supporting it because it was repackaged. Now, having said that, if that's a concern and the vendor install is usable to the point where I can put a wrapper around it and push it out, then that's probably the way I want to do it. But ultimately, if the vendor installer...
I think you might have froze.
Something
froze.
That's not...
I'm never sure. Wasn't sure if it was me that froze. We lost you there for a second, Mike. I think you're back.
Oh, you hear me okay?
Or
yeah, we do.
We do right now. You froze up for a minute.
Oh, sorry. I'm on my secondary backup internet connection, so to hopefully alleviate that. But but my take was, ultimately it goes back to the vendor, right? And you got to push back on those vendors and say, if you're not going to give me an installer that I can push out to my enterprise, and you won't let me repackage it, then you need to give me a better installer to begin with, right? It's all about quality.
Well, if you're calling for support, first of all, don't tell them you repackaged it, right? and really, I think what you're going for is, if your repackaged application exhibits a problem, install it normally, and if you can't recreate that problem, then you have a problem with your package, and you would not expect the vendor to help you with your repackaged, your package deployment, because then you're talking about a deployment problem with your approach. But if you have repackaged it and experience a problem, and then you install it normally, reproduce that problem, then why on earth would the vendor not support that? So I do see that come up as a reason that you might not want to repackage, but I think if you do have that concern, it should probably be for a very specific application or two, and not something that you really apply to the whole scope of your software portfolio, because it just doesn't. It's not a realistic problem.
It gets down to painting with too broad of a brush. I don't think you can go one single approach for every single one of your applications. Back in the day, early days, right, when EXE-based installers from vendors were truly horrible and they weren't really able to be pushed out silently, you really didn't have a choice. And you're like, listen, I got to push this out to several hundred, 1,000, 10,000 of my users, and I need a way to quickly do that. So I will go with the way that's going to get me there and produce that result in the least amount of time that's reliable, and I can push it out. So, you're kind of left with, I have to do something about this. Repackaging was often the case. Nowadays, and again, this is from enterprises telling us that more often than not, either they get MSIs, and great, that's already in a format that can easily be customized. But if it's not an MSI, but it's an EXE that has switches, they can push it out silently, right? They've tested it, it works fine. Then let's take with that, right? Let's take with what's already been done. If I don't have to rework things,
Right.
MSIs would give you some additional benefits, but do the benefits outweigh the time and effort to do it? Now, of course, through repackaging, we make it easy. We can automate a lot of that and make it quicker. But it's ultimately, how do I get this that's reliable, but in the least amount of time? And so with Admin Studio, we give you those different options.
Right, because sometimes you get a silent command line, and that could be good enough. But then if you want to customize it, now you got to get into being able to figure that out and make it happen. But some vendors, even their legacy setups, have more than silent switches. They have switches for don't automatically check for updates, or don't put desktop shortcuts down. So. And even configuration settings, sometimes you can pass a file that contains your configuration settings. It really depends on the efforts that the vendor went through to help you be successful with an enterprise deployment. So again, it goes back to you can't have one kind of policy that you try to fit to all applications, or you're gonna miss out for sure.
And especially a setup EXE is not the same. Every setup EXE could be different. If everybody used our Install Shield product, which would be great, right? Then you'd have a consistent process. But just because it's a setup EXE could be made with Install Shield, a Y script, or a number of other setups up there, and so there's no consistency there. So it could be a wrapper, and you got an MSI, and then you got to extract it, but you can't run the MSI by itself because it expects the EXE because it's doing some prerequisite checking. So it comes back to, unfortunately, I can't just tell you here's the easy button. I'll do this in every single case, but it does come back to research and figuring out what the best thing to do. The question I often get: how do I get my application? How do I get the licensing information so it's licensed? Well, first and foremost, you want to make sure you're not pushing out a single user license to 100 different users, right? You want to make sure you're pushing out the license the right way. So having said that, right, let's say you have a software, you got to push it out to 50 users. Your license key allows for that. Assuming that, it depends on how the vendor implemented it. Every vendor implements their licensing different. Some put it in a registry key, some put it in a file somewhere. And I can't just tell you, just always do this and it just handles the licensing. I don't know. Vendor A does licensing different than vendor B. So it goes back to that research, and sometimes maybe utilizing our repackager to see kind of the inner workings and where it puts things gives you a better idea of what you need to do. And maybe it is, maybe I just, as part of my wrapper script, right, I can run it silently with the command line options applied, and through the wrapper script, the post install action is add this registry key, right? And that might be enough. And maybe repackaging, you could replicate the same thing, but it might be more effort to get it through, to get to that approach, or to get to that conclusion. So it really depends.
That licensing complexity really is a fun topic, because it's not so much a repackaging challenge as it is a deployment challenge, right? If you have 50 licenses, you could probably get away if there's no checks preventing it with using the same license 50 times. And you'd be covered if you were audited or checked. You'd say, well, I own 50. I just didn't put 50 different licenses on 50 different machines.
Unique ones.
For sake of convenience. If you're staying under that 50 or whatever you bought, you're probably okay. But in a lot of cases, there'll be checks involved that prevent you from doing that. You have to jump through extra hoops. Yeah, fun times.
Yeah.
Karen?
Hey, Bob, here's a question that's posed. This actually goes into like repackaging, but could you guys talk a little bit more about the packaging and like request and the flow, and how that works either with regards to Workflow Manager, or just kind of see what we see from other customers? I know typically what I've heard from other customers is usually it goes in through like an ITSM, through either an app store like App Broker, or through ServiceNow, right, where that request kicks off. But maybe you and OC and Kieran could talk a little bit more about what you guys have seen from other customers.
You want to take that, Kieran?
Yeah, it depends on what is the process you have set up in your organization for application request, right? Everybody has got a different process. It's not that, everybody follows a single process for application or a new software request. Basically, it's generally referred as new software request. Now, while if I can talk about Admin Studio and Workflow Manager itself, and let's say we don't talk about any other tools like ServiceNow or ITSM, so there is a beautiful template within Workflow Manager for a new software request. It has got a set of standard steps that are generally performed as a standard for any new softwares. So the workflow will guide you through what are the steps that you need to perform. And where the question comes about, hey, do you want to repackage or wrap, or do you want to test the compatibility for Windows 10 or whatever the your target deployment system is, and also, hey, do you want to publish this to Config Manager or Alteryx or let's say Intune, right? All of these could be configured in your workflow. Right now, once you're done with the workflow, then you start the process. Okay, you get a new software from the vendor, and now you take a call, you want to repackage. There you automatically integrate with Admin Studio. Now you repackage or wrap, the option is yours. You do that, and then the next step in the workflow kicks. So the next one would be, okay, now I've repackaged. Now the next question is, do I want to test the compatibility, or do I just want to move it to the deployment system like Config Manager? And you could do that. So that is the process that you could generally follow. That is the workflow that you could follow. But in case you have a different system like ITSM or something, somewhere in the middle, you could trigger ITSM request to continue the process from there.
Yeah, it really is a very unique kind of circumstance for every organization, right? I'm sure there's best practices, and we try to lay down what we think is a logical approach, but almost everybody removes some steps, adds some steps, adds configurations. So, that's why a workflow solution like Workflow Manager, for example, they'll give you a template to start with, like here's a recommendation, just to get you going faster, so you don't have to recreate the standard things that everybody uses. But it is a very organization-specific type of thing. And a lot of times I think it comes down to where have you gotten burned, right? So I always say, and it's not a unique idea, that if you learn from your mistake, that maybe that mistake wasn't so terrible, or just the idea of making the same mistake 2 or 3 times, then you look like an idiot. But the first time you're learning a lesson and you're fixing a process. And so if you have a process to fix that says, okay, let's make sure that we don't test as admin anymore. We make that part of the process, kind of the definition of done for our packaging project. If we deployed it one time and it turned out we didn't actually have a license for it, then okay, well, let's add a step to our process that says we're going to check for licenses and make sure that we have it covered before it gets to the deployment phase. These types of things. So I think starting with a kind of a standard type process, if you have nothing, is a nice step in the right direction. But then you're very likely to customize that from lessons learned within your organization, or possibly in sessions like these, or events and seminars where people share their war stories about things that they've gone through, and maybe you can learn from someone else's mistake and not make it yourself.
Yeah, so here's an example of one of the customers that I've heard using. Since Spencer also talked about App Broker, right? So they had this integration between Admin Studio, App Broker, and App Broker was integrated with, I think, ServiceNow. So
and
you do all the packaging.
Might not be something everybody recognizes. So App Broker is the new name.
App Portal, yeah.
For App Portal, yeah. So App Portal was the store, right? It was kind of a enterprise app store interface. And App Broker came to be because we found that more and more customers were really interested in the logic and actions of App Portal, but had their own store like ServiceNow or something that they wanted to use. So I just wanted to inject that when you say App Broker, you mean kind of App Portal engine that it lives on.
Right. So the way it was set up is, so Admin Studio was integrated with the Configuration Manager, and App Portal / App Broker was integrated with the same Configuration Manager, and they also had ServiceNow integrated with app portal. So all of this was set up perfectly. So now the repackaging or wrapping or preparation of the package happened in Admin Studio, and Admin Studio would hand off the package to Configuration Manager using our publish functionality, right? That would automatically create an instance of this application in the App Store, that is App Portal. Now this application would be available for the user to request from the App Store to install on his device. And let's say in any case the installation fails, or if there is any process that fails during this entire flow, App Broker would automatically trigger ServiceNow for a ticket creation. So that would create a ticket and get assigned to an appropriate person for getting it fixed or to look into the issue. So this, I think, was totally automated. So it's up to the user, log into your enterprise app store, which will be App Portal. You select the application that you want to, and then you try to install this. And if something goes wrong, an automatic service ticket will be triggered for it, and then the issue would be addressed. So this I've seen in one of the customer environment when I had one of these interactions really some time ago.
It's all about automating the one-offs, right? Do we really need? Yes. I remember going to I forget the company, but they used the Microsoft's the config manager, I think they call it an application catalog, their request portal. And that one allowed for either anybody can have the app, or if you request it, it has to be approved. They had one guy that that's what his job was to look at the request, approve it, look at the request, approve it. And if you could, he wanted to do other things, not just sit there all day and approve requests, one-off ones. That's where something like our App Broker solution can automate that. And not just say yes, but to check for the license first and say, hey, do we have licenses? If we don't, let's make sure we purchase new ones. If everyone else says, yeah, let's push it out, get the licenses, make sure that they're procured, and then we can go ahead and push it out. So there's definitely checks and there's different steps that need to go through. And if we can have a system perform a lot of those, if not all of the checks for you, then you don't need somebody just sitting there approving one-off requests. That's where we've seen a lot of time savings with customers. That way, those people can go off and they've got lots of other things. Usually, everybody's got multiple things to do, and that way we free it up and allow them to do other things versus just doing these one-off things, these one-off requests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the deployment can be a puzzle. Just like I use the puzzle analogy a lot when I'm talking about packaging, right? Like some apps are very easy, you can get them done no problem, and some are pretty complex and they could take you a long time to really figure out and work through. And it's not just how does the application work and how should I get it out the door, but how should I customize it? How should I go about the deployment? And even the deployment, we were talking about the PowerShell App Deploy Toolkit being something that can provide a user interface. It can do things like let the user know that you need to shut down the browser in order to run the installation, or it's going to require a reboot. You want to delay the install till later and allow it to delay so many times. These types of things are really valuable, but they are also often functions of the deployment system. So maybe your endpoint management system has those functions. Maybe you want to handle it there, or maybe you want to handle it in the package itself for whatever reason, depending on who's responsible and what kind of controls and customization options you have. But it's, there's just an endless number of variables in the process of an application request to getting it out the door and on everybody's machines. There's so many different things that you might have to consider along the way that are often application specific.
Bob, here's another question that we got, and it's kind of more towards I think MSIX, but do we know why Microsoft is moving away from MSI as it relates to Office installs and SQL Server?
It's got its own limitations, right? Like it can't update system files is the main thing, because like the browser, IE was never a MSI package. You could actually get it as an MSI package that was an MSI wrapper to a command line install because it was updating these Windows protected files, and that was something that was off limits to the MSI's capabilities. So MSIX, by having a virtual container, gets around those, because you could have those Windows protected or copies of those Windows protected files in the container, so they appear to the application as installed without affecting the rest of the system. So, for consistency's sake, Microsoft was never really able to fully adopt Windows Installer because of some of the things that they, made as rules. And I think MSIX helps address a lot of those deficiencies. But there's, we've talked at length about the different benefits of Windows Install or MSIX, and I think this is a nod towards another one of those things, that we can actually have a setup format that could potentially do almost everything. Like, device drivers aren't going to be supported, and probably never will be, but we can handle those separately. I think we talked about this too, but device drivers in their applications should just be separated, and drivers should be handled like Windows updates and other lower level systems, and not as part of third-party application deployments.
And revisiting the premise of the question, right? Why is Microsoft doing MSIX? I think it goes to, right, more people are using other operating systems on their phones, on their other devices, and those other operating systems have kind of tried to simplify and make it easy to not only install but uninstall or remove applications. And Windows, since the beginning, it's always been about mixing installation files of applications along with the operating system. It's just, that's the way you had to do it. And now with like mobile operating systems, you remove the app and it's gone. There's no trace of it. That doesn't work that way in Windows. And so MSIX, to your point, Bob, being in a container, you remove the MSIX package, you've removed everything, the file system, the registry for that application. It's gone. There's no remnants. Yeah. There's no leave behind. So I think Microsoft, and I say it's a deficiency that's been around for forever, that they're finally looking at addressing, is to say, when I say I uninstall an application, I want to remove it off of Windows, it is gone. Even MSIs don't, if they're not, especially if they're not made properly, they don't guarantee that. They leave stuff behind, especially if there's custom actions.
I think the question, I took the question in the direction of MSIX because I think it's the answer. But I read the question to be, why isn't Microsoft using MSI or MSIX now in some of their key setups? Why are they legacy EXEs? And I think the reason most of the time is because of these Windows protected file system limitation.
No.
Okay, going back to our topic of repackaging and wrapping, right? One other thing I think that is interesting to would be interesting to look at before you take a call on do you want to repackage or wrap is how would this impact the product lineage? In few cases, let's say you take a vendor supplied setup file and then you repackage, and if you see that hey, there's actually breaking the product lineage. So let's say there is a new version of product available next time, and if it's not able to identify the previous version, then I think you should definitely consider wrapping as an option and avoid repackaging. But just before we got started, Mike was saying that, hey, if from the beginning, if you were repackaging this right from the day one, then I think that should not be a problem at all, right? Mike, you want to add something there?
Well, when you repackage, right, wrapping, we're trying to work within use the original vendor installation and then see if we can add logic around it to make it work, right? That's one method, and certainly a valuable method. And like I said, most enterprises today we talk with, more often than not, say that's the way they approach, and Admin Studio is cool with that, right? We can do PowerShell wrapping, we can do Y-script wrapping, any way you want to do it, right? There's no necessarily... Well, there probably are some wrong ways to do it, but we're flexible that way. Like, I think there's a question. Well, vendors do push back on me. Yeah, that's right. We give you the tools. We give you the with a plane and all the switches and let you fly wherever you want. But vendors,
I think that's the main reason you're not supposed to repackage an MSI, right? I mean, they'd always say never repackage a Windows installer setup that you already have, and the reason would always be because you can customize that as with a transform. But then I have to figure out, like, that's so much harder than just repackaging it. So people definitely did repackage Windows installer setups, and they would work, and it would be okay if you cleaned it up. But the big problem goes back to the root of what Kieran's saying is it broke the lineage. So now you have a Windows installer setup that has all different component GUIDs and doesn't understand the relationship between that new version that you get from the vendor next.
Right, because when you repackage, you're making a new installer. Right? Well, if you repackage, right, you're making a new installer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right, you're making a new installer, and you're creating all new GUIDs. Now, isn't there a tool, Kieran, as part of the Admin Studio package that will help you line up those component GUIDs?
Well, I think pretty much all the tools that we have. No, we have it in install shield anyway. You open MSX and we would show all the components and GUIDs there. But along with that, you could also see it in Application Manager, which is our biggest tool and the catalog itself. But is that what you're referring to, or?
No, I thought that there was a tool called like Upgrade Sync or something like that, where if you repackaged a setup and then you repackaged another one later and you wanted them, one to be a proper Windows installer update to the previous one, then there was a tool that would sync up those component GUIDs so it could function properly. Because if you have a repackaged Windows installer setup and then a new one, you really do have to uninstall the old one first, because your new repackaged setup is very different than your previous repackaged setup from a identification standpoint.
There are some MSI troubleshooting tools that come with the install shield editor as part of Admin Studio, like MSI diff and grep. So there's some ways to pull that information to quickly look and see, get those codes, see the differences and compare the two.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of a mess. And like we were saying before, like some people uninstall an application before they install a new one as a matter of practice. That'd be a reason to do so, right? If you had a repackaged setup and you were installing a new repackaged version of that setup, then you would want to uninstall the previous one first. So it adds another thing for you to consider based on decisions you made earlier. It goes back to this whole million variable scenario.
Right. That I would definitely say is a best practice for repackaging. You want to clean up your previous, uninstall it before you install this new repackaged setup.
Whereas if it was a vendor setup, you could just install the new one over the old one and retain your settings and have a much smoother experience. So that's a plus in the pros or cons to repackaging thing.
Right.
But again, and that's why I like the way your article is laid out. And someone asked for it. I sent a link. Maybe we can include it with the recording to this so that everybody can find it. It's in the Flexera community. But the idea was, here's a bunch of reasons why you might choose this, and here's a bunch of reasons why you might choose that. And it goes back to what Mike was saying, that it's very scenario based. And there's no recommendation that you should not repackage or that you should repackage. It's that you should have the tools that you need to do what you need to do. And until you attack the problem, you don't really know. One of the things that I had put into IT Ninja was whenever you would add a tip on an application, you would say how you went about its deployment. And the idea was to kind of crowdsource what people were doing for any given application. If most people are using the command line for this one, or most people are repackaging this one, most people are virtualizing this one. It's telling when you're doing that initial investigation for what you need to get done to see, what have others been doing. And that's one of the many things we're looking at for the future of Admin Studio, is being able to crowdsource, information, opt in, of course, to help guide you in the direction of what are other people doing. Because if everybody's virtualizing this application or everybody's repackaging this application, then there's probably a good reason for it. And probably the predominant reason for repackaging is obviously that there isn't a silent command line capability for that install. And we still see that a lot. So the package feed module that we have in Admin Studio now can give you details on over 3,000 installers, but they don't all have silent command line information. So sometimes we can tell you there's a new version. We can give you the setup file. We can tell you what the detection criteria is for your SCCM application deployment, but we can't give you the command line because there isn't one. So obviously you're in the right place, because if you want to repackage it, you've got a repackager right there. But that's really key, right? Understanding that there's a new version and that there isn't a command line. So it's kind of a hidden benefit, I think, of the package feed module that we should work to make more visible. That for those applications that don't have silent command lines, we can save you the trouble of looking because we've already looked.
Yeah.
Yeah, and over time, I think we all have witnessed that the set of files have become very mature. The vendors are trying to put in a lot of thought to give more support for silent installation. Back in the day, maybe there was never a silent installation, and then they maybe started adding just silent switches, and then they started adding customization. So over the time, what I'm seeing is, the setup installers are themselves getting mature, and they're being very stable, and there are a good number of silent command lines or the command line switches that are given, so you could install it silently or customize your setup. So this is also a good reason why you might want to consider wrapping, right? When you have such a beautiful support for command line, you might definitely want to consider wrapping.
Yeah. I see a question someone's asking, will MSIX support streaming? And the answer is no. So streaming, it isn't really a packaging technology as much as a delivery mechanism. And the good news is MSIX doesn't necessarily need it so much, because it's very smart about drive space optimization and network optimization. So it doesn't copy down what it doesn't need, and it doesn't lay down files that already exist. It's just pointers. So it's very efficient, and it kind of minimizes that need that streaming was trying to satisfy.
Yeah, this I've heard Microsoft always talking about when they talk about benefits of MSIX. They say when you upgrade to a new version, we make sure we don't replace the original installed MSIX with the new one, even if there are a bunch of files which are same or matching. So what they do in the upgrade is they just look at the delta, and then they push only the delta part. So that way the network is utilized really well, and even the bandwidth and all of that, right? So that way, right. I think this could be an answer for their streaming, that you don't have to worry. We don't push the entire package.
Right, and not even the entire files. Like, it's actually at the block level, which
absolutely yes,
super efficient.
Yeah.
And that whole idea of not overwriting files is a big win when it comes to deploying applications that are running, or applications that have a dependency on something that's in use, because it's not overwriting the file but just laying down what it needs alongside it. It's just pointers. So that need to reboot the computer is going to go way down, which is something that they've always strived for. Back in the early days of Windows, everything you did required a reboot. And they've been bragging about how the number of circumstances where you have to reboot has been dropping. And MSIX is, and I actually haven't heard them brag about that with MSIX, but it's definitely going to be another big reason that you don't have to reboot. And more importantly, that you don't have to stop users from their work. If they're using the application or a dependent application, it's okay. So deployment during working hours becomes a lot less risky than it is today.
Mm-hmm.
One other factor that you might want to consider, when you're in middle of, hey, should I repackage or wrapper, is what is your deployment system support? Let's say you don't have any distribution system or a deployment system or an endpoint management system like configuration manager, and you're still dependent on GPO policies for deployments. And we know that GPOs support only MSI, right? So in that case, I think you don't have an option of wrapping anyway. You have to take your vendor setup, which is .exe, and then move that to MSI. So you could use your existing deployment system and distribute this software through your group policies, right?
Yeah, we've got a lot of participation in our conversation in the Q&A today, which is awesome.
Yeah.
We'll have to, when we do our blog post at the end about questions, I'd love to include a lot of this. So I probably will, but won't be able to credit you because I can't I can't assume that you're okay with it. But really do appreciate the help and the participation that we're getting in the chat from so many people. Mm-hmm. It's great to see. We've got probably enough time for one more question if there's anything that stands out, Spencer.
You may have had a drop for something.
I have. Okay, I see this question. I think this will be a good question to answer. Does MSIX replace AppV? What's the future roadmap of MSIX in terms of its improvements and benefits?
Yeah, it will. Yeah, the intent is for MSIX to replace AppV. That being said, Microsoft's very careful not to tell anybody that that's happening right now. Like, don't change what you're doing. If you're having success with AppV, keep doing what you're doing. But eventually, at some point, the intent is most definitely that MSIX will replace it. But that being said, that's what Microsoft's saying about all setup formats. Windows Installer 2 will at some point be replaced by MSIX. But they're obviously taking their sweet time getting there. There's a lot of technical challenges, no doubt, and we've seen lots of great improvements. But there's no, they're not being very aggressive about, okay, it's ready now, you need to start using it. Like, they're not pushing us the way they did with Windows Installer. Windows Installer, a lot of people repackaged because they were using group policy, and you can only deploy Windows Installer packages with group policy. A lot of vendors started adopting MSIX not MSIX, but MSI because it was a requirement for Windows logo compatibility. If they wanted that sticker on their box, back when software had a box, and it said, works with Windows 7, XP. XP. So, if you wanted that works with XP accreditation, which would help sales, it had to be in Windows Installer format. So that requirement definitely drove adoption of it much faster, and that's not the approach they're taking with MSIX. So they're not stopping us or encouraging us to stop using MSI or AppV, but they are they're more forthcoming with the idea that MSIX replaces AppV than they have been pushing it as a replacement for MSI. But they end all of their presentations, the MSIX team, with MSIX is the future setup format. So the intent is to get there and for that to be the one setup format that we need.
Yeah. That's the intent, but there's no necessary timelines yet, right? There's no end date for any of this yet.
Right. Which is why I think everybody's interested in understanding it, but they're not jumping up and down. I need training. I need to start using it right now. So a lot of the people on the call I know are just they want to keep up with what's coming, but are probably relieved to hear that they don't necessarily have to drop what they're doing and worry about it right now.
Yep.
By participating in conversations like these, you're just getting ahead of the game, which is great.
And if you have Admin Studio, right? Especially, I was going to say, especially if you've got Admin Studio and Professional or Enterprise, you can start researching it, right? You can start creating those MSX packages, and it's not something you have to deploy right away. You don't have a timeline in which you have to get these out, but you can start looking at it. When and if you have the free time, right? You can start looking with it, seeing how it works, and integrating it. And as time goes on, it'll become something that'll be more and more, less and less research and more practical every day.
And we do have customers that are using it, like for real, right? Like they are packaging in MSIX and they're deploying MSIX and they're having success with it. So there's always the early adopters, but I think that's they're in the minority right now.
Yeah.
There's a question about This is a real quick one. We're actually out of time, but it was you mentioned Admin Studio having the ability to test against each release of Windows 10. Will that continue?
That is exactly
this year?
the question.
That's what you're looking at?
Great minds.
Will that continue this year with everything that's going on? And yes. I mean, we still have a big release planned for this first half, and we know that Windows 10 2004. That's the way they want you to say it. Not so the new Windows 10 build that's coming out very shortly is one that we intend to cover, and our approach has been that with each release we get ourselves caught up on things like Windows 10 compatibility with latest build, with any changes to the SCCM application model, and all these things that are constantly shifting. They are part of the installer. It's not an offline service that we can update outside the release cycle right now. So these releases are our opportunity to catch up, and we intend to do so.
Quickly, so I recall this joke when this new version of Windows was made available as a preview, and people started seeing Windows 10 2004. Right, it was 2004, so everybody read it as 2004, and it was actually considered as a bug. So that was the joke, and then people figured out, oh no, that is how their format is 1909, and now it is 2004.
At least there wasn't a Windows 2004. There was actually some risk that the build number would fall and be even more confusing by landing on a build that we actually did exist. We are over now and got to go, but I hope that you enjoyed this and that we see you here same time next week. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.